They poured a $300 bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon over his head in front of 100 of the city's most elite guests. They called him unworthy. They laughed as the wine dripped down his tailored suit. What they didn't know was that the man they just humiliated owned 42% of the company hosting the event, and he was the sole investor behind the billion-dollar deal they were celebrating that very night. This is the story of how one moment of cruelty unraveled an empire, and how the truth came crashing down before anyone even realized what they'd done. His name was Terence Baldwin, though most people in the financial world knew him only by his initials, TB, or as the Ghost because of how quietly he moved through deals worth hundreds of millions. At 53 years old, Terence had the kind of face that revealed nothing and everything at once. Deep-set brown eyes that had witnessed both poverty and prosperity. A closely trimmed beard with streaks of gray that he'd earned through decades of grinding, failing, rebuilding, and succeeding. He stood 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that still carried the memory of his construction worker days, back when he was putting himself through community college one semester at a time. Tonight, Terence wore a midnight blue Tom Ford suit, custom-made, perfectly fitted. Italian leather shoes that cost more than some people's monthly rent. But he didn't wear these things to show off. He wore them because he'd earned them, because 30 years ago he'd promised himself that if he ever made it out of the Southside projects, he'd dress like he belonged anywhere he walked. The irony wasn't lost on him that even now, even with all he'd achieved, he still had to prove he belonged. The event was being held at the Continental Grand Ballroom, a sprawling venue with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the downtown skyline. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the vaulted ceiling. White-gloved servers moved between clusters of guests, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres that cost more per bite than most families spent on dinner. This was the celebration for Meridian Tech Solutions' acquisition of a revolutionary AI patent, a deal worth $1.2 billion. A deal that Terence had personally financed through his private equity firm, though almost no one in that room knew it. See, Terence had built his fortune on being underestimated. While other investors demanded credit and recognition, he worked in the shadows, using shell companies and intermediaries. It gave him an advantage. People revealed their true selves when they thought you were nobody. And tonight he was about to get a masterclass in people's true selves. He'd arrived alone as he often did. His wife, Patricia, was visiting their daughter at Stanford and he'd told her he'd skip this one. Just another corporate event, he'd said. Nothing special. But something had pulled him here tonight. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was fate. Or maybe it was just that he wanted to see the culmination of 18 months of negotiations, to watch the executives toast to a deal they couldn't have closed without him. Terence grabbed a sparkling water from the bar and positioned himself near one of the marble columns, observing. That's when he first noticed her. Vivian Ashcroft, the newly appointed Chief Operating Officer of Meridian Tech Solutions. She was holding court near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by admirers and sycophants. Tall, blonde, probably in her late 30s, wearing a red dress that commanded attention. She had the kind of confidence that came from never being told no, from never having to fight for a seat at the table because one had always been waiting for her. Vivian's laugh cut through the ambient noise. Sure. Performative. She was telling a story, her hand gestures animated, her audience hanging on every word. Terence couldn't hear what she was saying from where he stood, but he could see the dynamic. She was the sun and everyone else was orbiting. Then their eyes met across the room. Just for a second. Terence saw something flicker in her expression. Not recognition. Assessment. Her gaze traveled from his face down to his shoes and back up, a once-over that took less than 3 seconds but communicated volumes. Then she looked away, dismissing him as quickly as she'd noticed him. Terence had seen that look before. 1,000 times before. It was the look that said, "You don't matter." He took a sip of his water and smiled to himself. If only she knew. The evening progressed. Speeches were made. The CEO of Meridian Tech, a silver-haired man named Douglas Whitmore, took the microphone and droned on about innovation and disruption and market leadership. Terence listened with half an ear. He'd heard it all before. Every tech company used the same buzzwords, the same empty promises. What mattered were the numbers, and the numbers on this deal were spectacular. Meridian Tech would triple in value within 5 years if they executed properly. And Terence would be there, in the shadows, collecting his returns. As Douglas wrapped up his speech, the crowd applauded politely. That's when Terence decided to stretch his legs. He'd been standing in the same spot for nearly an hour, and his knee was starting to ache, an old injury from his days working construction. He moved toward the hallway where the restrooms were located, navigating through small clusters of conversation. He was almost to the hallway when someone bumped into him. Hard enough that Terence had to step back to catch his balance. When he looked up, he found himself face to face with a young man in his mid-20s, preppy, wearing a suit that probably cost $3,000 but somehow still looked cheap on him. The kid's face was flushed with alcohol, his eyes glassy. "Watch where you're going," the young man slurred, even though he'd been the one who'd bumped into Terence. Terence raised his hands in a peace gesture. "My apologies," he said evenly. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. But the young man wasn't done. "Do you even belong here?" he asked, his voice loud enough that several nearby conversations stopped. "This is an invitation-only event." Terence felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. Here we go, he thought. "I was invited," he said simply. "By who?" The young man took a step closer, invading Terence's personal space. "What company are you with?" Before Terence could respond, a woman's voice cut through the tension. "Harrison, what's going on here?" It was Vivian. She glided over with two other executives in tow, her expression one of mild curiosity mixed with annoyance. Up close, Terence could see she was even more striking than he'd first thought. Angular features. Ice blue eyes. The kind of beauty that had probably opened every door she'd ever approached. Harrison, the drunk young man, turned to her with a grin. "Just making sure we don't have any party crashers, Ms. Ashcroft. This guy seems a little out of place, don't you think?" Vivian's gaze settled on Terence, and this time she really looked at him. Her eyes took in every detail, calculating, measuring. "I don't recognize you," she said, her tone polite but with an edge underneath. "Are you with one of our vendor companies?" The implication was clear. The assumption built into the question. Terence could feel the eyes of other guests beginning to turn their way. Conversations were pausing. Phones were subtly being raised. In the age of social media, every confrontation was potential content. "I'm an investor," Terence said calmly. "I have a stake in Meridian Tech." Vivian's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. "Really? That's interesting because I know all of our major investors and I definitely don't know you." She turned to the men flanking her. "Do either of you recognize this gentleman?" They both shook their heads, smirking. One of them, a portly man with a red face and thinning hair, added, "Ma'am, I think someone might have crashed the party. Should I call security?" Terence felt his jaw tighten. He could end this right now. He could pull out his phone, make one call, and watch their faces change from smug superiority to horror. But something stopped him. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was curiosity. He wanted to see how far they'd take this. He wanted to see who they really were when they thought there were no consequences. "I have an invitation," Terence said evenly. "Would you like to see it?" "That won't be necessary," Vivian said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "But I think there's been a misunderstanding. This event is for C-suite executives and major stakeholders only. Perhaps you're thinking of the vendor appreciation dinner? That was last month." Laughter rippled through the growing crowd. Terence could feel his heart pounding, but his face remained neutral. He'd spent decades mastering his poker face, never giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing they'd gotten to him. Harrison, emboldened by Vivian's backup, stepped even closer. "Yeah, maybe you should leave before this gets embarrassing," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. That's when Douglas Whitmore, the CEO, appeared at the edge of the circle. He'd been alerted to the commotion and came over to see what was happening. "What's all this about?" he asked, his voice carrying authority. Vivian turned to him with a practiced smile. "Nothing to worry about, Douglas. Just a small confusion. This gentleman seems to have wandered into the wrong event." Douglas looked at Terence, and for a moment, Terence thought he saw a flicker of something in the older man's eyes. Recognition? Doubt. But it passed quickly, replaced by the same dismissive assessment everyone else had given him. "I see," Douglas said. "Well, we can't have that. This is a private function." And that's when it happened. That's when Harrison, drunk and emboldened by the support of his superiors, grabbed the glass of wine from Vivian's hand and, with a theatrical flourish, poured it over Terence's head. The red liquid cascaded down Terence's face, soaking into his hair, dripping onto his expensive suit. The ballroom went silent. Completely silent. 100 elite guests stood frozen, some with their mouths open in shock, others with phones raised, recording every second. "Oops," Harrison said with a laugh that sounded more nervous than confident now that he'd actually done it. "Sorry about that. Guess you should have left when you had the chance." Terence stood completely still. Wine dripped from his chin onto his shirt. He could feel it running down his back, cold and sticky. He looked at Harrison, then at Vivian, then at Douglas. None of them moved to help. None of them apologized. Vivian actually had a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The silence stretched. Someone coughed. A glass clinked somewhere in the distance. Terrence reached up slowly and wiped wine from his eyes. Then he did something that would later be discussed and analyzed in boardrooms and business schools across the country. He smiled. Not an angry smile. Not a threatening smile. Just a small, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. Without saying a word, Terrence reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved across the screen with deliberate precision. He typed out a message. Then another. Then a third. The whole time everyone watched. Phones recorded. Whispers started spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Who is this guy? Why isn't he freaking out? What is he doing on his phone? Terrence hit send on the final message, slipped his phone back into his pocket and looked up at the crowd. He made eye contact with Vivian one last time. Something in his expression must have finally triggered an alarm in her brain because her smile faltered. Just for a second. Just enough for Terrence to see the first crack in her armor. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. He didn't rush. He didn't run. He walked with the same quiet confidence he'd had when he arrived. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He could hear the whispers getting louder behind him. Who was that? Did you see that? This is going to be all over social media. Someone's getting fired for this. Terrence pushed through the ballroom doors and stepped into the cool night air. He took a deep breath, letting it fill his lungs, letting it calm the storm raging inside him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. What? Twice. 3 times. 4 times. The messages were coming in fast now. But Terrence didn't look at them. Not yet. He walked to where his car was parked, a modest black sedan that didn't scream wealth, and climbed into the driver's seat. Only then did he allow himself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. The humiliation. The rage. The bitter familiarity of it all. He'd been 12 years old the first time someone had treated him like he didn't belong. He'd wandered into a library in a nice neighborhood, just wanting to read, and the librarian had followed him around, watching him like he was going to steal something. He'd been 25 when a bank manager had laughed at his business plan, told him to be realistic, told him people like him didn't become successful entrepreneurs. He'd been 38 when a potential investor had said to his face that he didn't fit the profile of someone they'd want to be in business with. Each time Terrence had swallowed the anger. Each time he'd used it as fuel. Each time he'd proved them wrong. But it never got easier. Success didn't make the sting of racism hurt any less. Money didn't shield you from assumptions and stereotypes. He'd just gotten better at hiding how much it affected him. Terrence pulled out his phone and looked at the messages. They were from his attorney, his chief financial officer, and the chairman of his private equity firm's board. All 3 had seen the videos already. The incident had happened less than 10 minutes ago, and it was already circulating online. His attorney's message was simple. I saw. What do you want to do? Terrence typed back, everything we discussed. Start with the board notification. His CFO wrote, the numbers are ready. Just say when. Terrence replied, now. The chairman's message was longer. Terrence, I just saw what happened. This is unacceptable. Do you want me to reach out to Douglas directly? Terrence thought about it for a moment, then typed, no. Let it play out. They need to understand what they've done without any warnings. He put the phone down and started the engine. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he allowed himself one more small smile. The fallout had already begun and they didn't even know it yet. Back in the ballroom, the party was trying to resume some sense of normalcy, but the atmosphere had changed. Clusters of guests were huddled together, talking in hushed voices, showing each other videos on their phones. The incident had already been posted to Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. It was being shared, commented on, dissected. Vivian stood near the bar, her earlier confidence shaken but not broken. Harrison had disappeared, probably to the bathroom to throw up or to hide from the consequences of his actions. Douglas was on his phone, his face growing more concerned with each passing minute. It's fine, Vivian said to the small group around her, though her voice lacked its earlier certainty. He was probably just some low-level investor who got his feelings hurt. People are too sensitive these days. One of the other executives, a woman named Jennifer Cho who served as the chief technology officer, shook her head. I don't know, Viv. The way he smiled before he left. The way he was so calm. That's not how someone acts when they've been defeated. That's how someone acts when they know something you don't. You're being paranoid, Vivian said, but her hand trembled slightly as she took a sip of her champagne. Douglas walked over, his face pale. We need to talk, he said quietly. In private. Now. They moved to a small conference room off the main ballroom. Douglas closed the door behind them and turned to face Vivian and the two other executives who'd been involved in the confrontation. "Someone just sent me a link," Douglas said, holding up his phone. "The video is everywhere. #wine incident is already trending." "So what?" Vivian said, though her voice had lost most of its edge. "Bad press happens. We'll put out a statement. We'll say it was a misunderstanding. We'll donate to some charity. This will blow over in a week." Douglas looked at her like she just suggested they set the building on fire. "You don't understand. I've been getting calls. Angry calls. From board members. From investors." He paused, his hands shaking. "From people asking why we just humiliated Terrence Baldwin." The name hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Vivian's face went white. Jennifer gasped. The portly executive who'd suggested calling security looked like he might faint. "Terrence Baldwin," Vivian repeated slowly. "As in TB Capital? As in the ghost?" Douglas nodded grimly. "The same. Apparently, he owns 42% of our company through a network of holding companies. And according to the messages I'm getting, he was the sole investor who financed the acquisition we're celebrating tonight." The room was silent except for the sound of Vivian's champagne glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the marble floor. Can you believe they had no idea who they were humiliating? What would you do if you were in Terrence's position? Let us know in the comments below. While Douglas and his executives were having their panic attack in the conference room, Terrence was at home, changing out of his wine-stained suit. His phone had been buzzing non-stop for the past 30 minutes. Calls from journalists, from other investors, from friends and colleagues who'd seen the videos. He'd ignored them all. Patricia had called twice. He'd answered the second time and given her the brief version of what happened. She'd been furious, ready to drive back from Stanford immediately. He'd talked her down, assured her he was fine, told her he had it handled. She knew him well enough to hear what he wasn't saying. He was hurt, he was angry, but he was also already 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Terrence pulled on a comfortable pair of jeans and an old Northwestern sweatshirt, a reminder of the state school where he'd earned his MBA while working 3 jobs. He poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, the good stuff he saved for special occasions, and settled into his favorite chair in the study. The room was lined with bookshelves holding everything from classic literature to contemporary business theory. Framed photos sat on his desk. Patricia on their wedding day, their daughter Simone graduating from high school, his mother at age 90, just before she passed. And in the corner, almost hidden behind newer frames, a photo of young Terrence in a hard hat and work boots, standing in front of a half-built house, grinning at the camera. That photo was from 31 years ago. Terrence had been 22, working construction to pay for community college classes at night. He'd had $3 in his bank account and dreams bigger than anyone believed possible. Everyone had told him to be realistic. His high school guidance counselor had suggested trade school. His first boss had laughed when Terrence mentioned wanting to start his own business someday. But Terrence had a gift for numbers. He could look at a construction project and calculate costs in his head faster than people using calculators. He could see opportunities where others saw only risk. And most importantly, he had something to prove. His first business had been a small contracting company. He'd saved every penny for 2 years to afford the license and insurance. He'd worked 18-hour days doing the labor himself, underbidding competitors, building a reputation for quality and reliability. Within 5 years, he'd expanded into commercial real estate development. Within 10, he was consulting for private equity firms. Within 15, he'd started his own fund. Now, at 53, Terrence Baldwin's net worth was estimated at somewhere north of $2 billion. He had investments in everything from technology startups to renewable energy to affordable housing developments. He employed over 15,000 people across various companies. He donated hundreds of millions to scholarships, community centers, and economic development programs in underserved neighborhoods. And tonight, he'd been treated like a party crasher because of the color of his skin. Terrence took a sip of bourbon and opened his laptop. His executive assistant had sent him a detailed timeline of what had happened after he left the ballroom. The videos had gone viral within minutes. The hashtag was trending worldwide. Major news outlets were picking up the story. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements. Celebrities were commenting. The incident had touched a nerve in a way that even Terrence hadn't fully anticipated. More importantly, his team had executed the first phase of his response. Notices had been sent to the Meridian Tech Board of Directors informing them of his ownership stake and requesting an emergency meeting. His attorneys had drafted a formal complaint about the treatment he'd received. His CFO had prepared analysis showing exactly how much value Terrence's investment had brought to the company. But that was just the beginning. Terrence had spent 18 months carefully structuring his investment in Meridian Tech. He'd done it through a web of holding companies and intermediaries specifically to maintain anonymity and flexibility. What Douglas and Vivian didn't understand yet was that Terrence's 42% stake gave him effective control of the company. The remaining 58% was split among dozens of smaller investors, none of whom held more than 5% individually. In corporate terms, Terrence didn't just have a voice. He had a veto. He had the power to block any major decision. He could remove board members. He could replace executives. He could, if he chose to, dismantle everything they'd built. But Terrence wasn't interested in destruction for its own sake. He'd built his entire career on creating value, on making smart investments that generated returns while also doing some good in the world. Meridian Tech had real potential. The AI patent they just acquired could revolutionize everything from healthcare diagnostics to climate modeling. With the right leadership and proper execution, the company could change lives while making everyone involved very wealthy. The question was whether the current leadership deserved to be part of that future. Terrence's phone rang. He looked at the caller ID and saw it was Martin Chin, the chairman of his firm's advisory board and one of his oldest friends. Terrence answered. "I saw," Martin said without preamble. "I've been in meetings for the past hour and I saw. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Terrence said. "That's what you always say. Even when you're not." Terrence smiled despite himself. Martin had known him since business school. They'd been roommates, study partners, and eventually business partners before Martin had retired to focus on philanthropy. If anyone could read between his lines, it was Martin. "It was humiliating," Terrence admitted. "Standing there with wine dripping down my face while 100 people watched and did nothing. While they laughed." He paused. "I'm 53 years old, Martin. I've spent 3 decades building something meaningful. I've earned respect in this industry. And tonight, none of that mattered because some drunk kid and a power-hungry executive looked at me and saw what they wanted to see instead of who you actually are," Martin finished quietly. "I know, my friend. I know." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding hanging between them. Martin was Chinese-American, and while his experiences weren't identical to Terrence's, he understood what it meant to be constantly underestimated, to have your credentials questioned, to have to work twice as hard for half the recognition. "The board is meeting tomorrow," Martin said, shifting to business. "Emergency session. Douglas called it himself once he figured out who you were. They're panicking." "Good," Terrence said. "What do you want to do? You have options here. You could demand resignations. You could threaten to pull your investment. You could sue for discrimination. You could go public with everything and let the court of public opinion destroy them." Terrence swirled the bourbon in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. "What I want," he said slowly, "is for this to mean something. Not just for me. For everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. For every person who's been judged by their appearance instead of their achievements. So you want to make an example of them. I want to make them understand. Really understand. What they did. Why it was wrong. And what needs to change." Martin was quiet for a moment. "That's a tall order, Terrence. People like Vivian Ashcroft, they don't change their minds easily. They're too invested in their worldview." "Maybe," Terrence said. "But they're about to get a very expensive education." After he hung up with Martin, Terrence spent the next several hours working. He reviewed the investor agreements. He studied the company bylaws. He looked at organizational charts and financial projections. He compiled everything he needed to walk into that board meeting tomorrow fully prepared to do whatever was necessary. Around midnight he received an email from an unexpected source. The subject line read, "I owe you an apology." The sender was Jennifer Cho, the CTO who'd been standing with Vivian during the incident. Terrence opened it and read, "Mr. Baldwin, I don't know if you'll read this or if you'll care, but I need to say it anyway. What happened tonight was wrong. I stood there and watched it happen and I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my place to intervene. I told myself I didn't know the full situation. But those were just excuses for my cowardice. I should have spoken up. I should have stopped it. I didn't, and I'm ashamed of that. I don't expect forgiveness and I don't expect this email to change anything. I just wanted you to know that at least one person in that room recognizes how badly we failed tonight. Whatever consequences come from this, we deserve them. Sincerely, Jennifer Cho." Terrence read the email 3 times. It was the first genuine apology he'd received all night, and it came from someone who hadn't even been the main perpetrator. He sat back in his chair, considering his response. After a few minutes he typed, "Dr. Cho, I appreciate your email. The courage it takes to admit a mistake is often greater than the courage it takes to prevent one. I hope tomorrow's board meeting will be an opportunity for honest reflection about how we treat people and what kind of company Meridian Tech wants to be. Best, Terrence Baldwin." He hit send and closed his laptop. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in Meridian Tech's executive conference room. Terrence arrived at 8:45, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, crisp white shirt, and a deep blue tie. He carried a leather briefcase that contained 30 years of experience condensed into a 40-page presentation. The receptionist's eyes went wide when she saw him. She'd obviously seen the videos. Everyone had seen the videos. By this morning, the incident had been covered by every major news outlet. Think pieces were being written about racism in corporate America. Politicians were making statements. The story had taken on a life of its own. "Mr. Baldwin," she said, her voice shaking slightly. They're expecting you in the main conference room. Would you like me to show you the way?" "I know where it is," Terrence said with a polite smile. "Thank you." He walked through the glass-walled corridors of Meridian Tech's headquarters, aware of the stares following him. Employees stopped typing to watch him pass. Conversations halted mid-sentence. He'd become something he never wanted to be, a symbol, a viral moment, a hashtag. But if that was the price of accountability, he'd pay it. The conference room doors were closed when he arrived. Terrence could see shadows moving behind the frosted glass. He checked his watch. 8:57. He waited, standing in the hallway, giving them these last few minutes to squirm. At exactly 9 a.m., Terrence opened the doors and walked in. 12 people sat around a massive mahogany table. Douglas at the head. Vivian on his right, looking like she hadn't slept. Jennifer Cho on his left, her eyes red-rimmed. The rest were board members, investors, and senior executives. Every face turned toward him as he entered. "Good morning," Terrence said evenly. He walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table from Douglas and set down his briefcase. "Thank you for convening this meeting on such short notice." Douglas cleared his throat. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "Mr. Baldwin, I want to start by saying how deeply sorry we are about what happened last night. It was completely unacceptable, and it does not reflect the values of this company." Terrence held up a hand. "Before we get to apologies, let's talk about facts. I'd like everyone in this room to understand exactly who I am and what my relationship to this company is." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, sliding copies across the table. "As you can see here, I hold 42% of Meridian Tech through TB Capital and its associated holding companies. I was the sole investor who financed the $1.2 billion acquisition you were celebrating last night. My investment has increased this company's valuation by 340% over the past 18 months. He paused, letting that sink in. Several board members were flipping through the documents, their faces growing paler with each page. "Now," Terrence continued, "let's talk about what happened last night. I attended a company event to which I was legitimately invited. I was approached by employees who questioned my right to be there based solely on my appearance. I was publicly humiliated. And then I was assaulted when an intoxicated employee poured wine on me while dozens of people watched and recorded." Vivian spoke up, her voice tight. "Mr. Baldwin, if I'd known who you were—" "Stop," Terrence said, his voice sharp enough to cut. "Right there. That's the problem. If you'd known who I was. The issue isn't that you didn't recognize me. The issue is how you treated someone you didn't recognize. Tell me, Ms. Ashcroft, would you have acted the same way if I'd been a white man in a Tom Ford suit?" The silence in the room was deafening. Vivian's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Let me answer that for you," Terrence said. "No. You wouldn't have. You would have introduced yourself. You would have made conversation. At worst, you might have politely asked if I had an invitation. But you wouldn't have assumed I was a party crasher. You wouldn't have suggested I belonged at a vendor dinner. And you certainly wouldn't have stood by while someone assaulted me." One of the board members, an elderly man named Richard Sutton, spoke up. "Mr. Baldwin, you're absolutely right. What happened was inexcusable. We need to address this immediately. Harrison Pembroke has been terminated, effective immediately. We're also prepared to offer you a formal written apology and, frankly, whatever else you feel is appropriate." Terrence looked at him. Harrison Pembroke was drunk and stupid, but he's not the real problem. The real problem is the culture that made him think his actions were acceptable. The real problem is leadership that either actively participated in or passively allowed discrimination to occur. All eyes turned to Vivian. She sat very still, her hands clasped on the table in front of her, her knuckles white. "I made a mistake," she said quietly. "A terrible mistake. And I'm sorry." "Are you sorry you did it or sorry you got caught?" Terrence asked. Vivian flinched. "I'm sorry I did it. I'm sorry I made assumptions. I'm sorry I let my biases cloud my judgment." Terrence studied her. He'd dealt with enough people over the years to recognize genuine contrition versus performative apology. Vivian was somewhere in between. She was sorry but mostly because it was affecting her career. Still, that was better than some of the others in the room who were clearly just angry they'd been caught. "Here's what's going to happen," Terrence said, pulling out another document. "Meridian Tech is going to implement a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program. Not the usual lip service. Real change. We're going to conduct an independent audit of hiring, promotion, and compensation practices. We're going to establish mentorship programs for employees from underrepresented backgrounds. We're going to create a board seat specifically designated for someone with expertise in equity and inclusion." He slid the document across to Douglas. "This outlines everything in detail. It's non-negotiable. If this company wants to continue benefiting from my investment, these changes will be implemented within 90 days. Douglas scanned the document, his eyebrows rising. "This is extensive." "Yes, it is. Because cosmetic changes don't work. Real transformation requires real commitment." Another board member, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, spoke up. "Mr. Baldwin, I don't disagree with anything you're proposing. But I have to ask, what about Vivian? What about the other executives who were involved?" Terrence turned his gaze to Vivian. She met his eyes and he saw fear there but also something else. A glimmer of understanding, maybe. Or maybe just resignation. "That's not my decision to make," Terrence said. "I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in accountability." Ms. Ashcroft demonstrated poor judgment and allowed bias to influence her actions. Whether she stays or goes should depend on whether she's capable of learning from this and becoming part of the solution. He stood up, collecting his papers. "I'll leave that to the board to decide. But understand this, the world is watching now. Whatever you decide, it needs to be just. Not just for me but for everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong in spaces they've earned the right to occupy." Terrence walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. "One more thing. I want a written report in 30 days outlining the specific steps being taken to implement these changes. And I want quarterly reviews after that. This isn't a one-time conversation. This is an ongoing commitment." Douglas nodded, looking exhausted but also, strangely, a bit relieved. "You'll have it, Mr. Baldwin. You have my word." Terrence left the conference room and walked through the corridors back to the elevator. The same employees who'd stared at him on the way and were watching him leave, but the energy was different now. Some looked ashamed. Others looked thoughtful. A few younger employees, particularly people of color, caught his eye and gave him small nods of solidarity. As Terrence stepped into the elevator, Jennifer Cho appeared, slightly out of breath like she'd been running. "Mr. Baldwin, wait please." The elevator doors started to close, but Terrence hit the button to hold them open. "Dr. Cho." She stepped into the elevator with him and the doors closed, leaving them alone in the small space. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for what you said in there. About giving people a chance to learn and be part of the solution. That was generous." Terrence looked at her. "You sent me an apology last night. A real one. That matters. I should have done more than apologize. I should have stopped it from happening in the first place." "Yes," Terrence agreed. "You should have. But you can't change the past. You can only decide what kind of person you want to be going forward." The elevator reached the ground floor and the doors opened. Jennifer extended her hand. "I hope I get the chance to prove I can be better." Terrence shook her hand. "I hope so too, Dr. Cho." He walked out of the building and into the bright morning sunshine. His phone was already buzzing with messages from Martin, from his team, from journalists wanting statements. But Terrence ignored them for now. He needed a moment to process everything that had just happened. The truth was he didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired. Tired of having to prove himself. Tired of having to be twice as good to get half as far. Tired of carrying the weight of representation, of knowing that every time he walked into a room, he wasn't just Terrence Baldwin, successful investor. He was a black man in a predominantly white space, and everything he did would be scrutinized through that lens. But he also felt something else. Hope maybe. Or at least the possibility of hope. Because what happened in that boardroom mattered. Not just the policies he'd forced them to adopt, but the conversation itself. The uncomfortable, necessary conversation about bias and assumptions and who gets to belong in elite spaces. Terrence drove to a small coffee shop in a neighborhood far from the gleaming towers of the financial district. It was a place he'd been coming to for years, long before he had money, back when a $3 coffee was a luxury he had to budget for. The owner, a Dominican woman named Rosa, greeted him with a warm smile and knowing eyes. "I saw the news," she said as she poured his usual dark roast. "You okay, Mijo?" Terrence smiled. Rosa had been calling him Mijo since he was a struggling graduate student working on business plans in the corner booth. "I'm okay, Rosa. Better than okay, actually." "Good. Because those people, they're idiots if they can't see what you are." "And what's that?" Rosa set the coffee in front of him and patted his hand. "A good man who worked hard for everything he has. That's all that should matter." Terrence sat in his usual corner booth and sipped his coffee, watching the neighborhood wake up. A mother walked by with 3 kids in school uniforms. An elderly man was opening his barber shop. Across the street, 2 teenagers were laughing about something on their phones. Normal people living normal lives, most of whom would never attend a billion-dollar gala or sit in a corporate boardroom. But they deserved to be treated with dignity just as much as he did. That was the point. That was what he was fighting for, not just for himself but for everyone who'd ever been made to feel less than. His phone rang. It was Patricia. "I'm watching the news," she said. "They're reporting about the board meeting. About the changes you're demanding. Terrence, I'm so proud of you." "I haven't won anything yet," he said. "They agreed to the policies, but implementation is what matters. Talk is cheap." "I know. But you stood up. You didn't let them get away with it. You used your power to demand change. That matters." Terrence felt something loosen in his chest. Patricia always knew exactly what to say. "When are you coming home?" "Tomorrow. Simone wants to talk to you, by the way. She's been texting me all morning. She wants to know if you're okay." "Put her on." There was a rustling sound, and then his daughter's voice came through. "Dad? Oh my God, Dad, I can't believe what happened. Are you seriously okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. I promise. Everyone here is talking about it. My professors, my friends, everyone. They're calling you a hero." Terrence felt uncomfortable with that label. "I'm not a hero, Simone. I'm just someone who refused to accept being treated badly." "That's exactly what makes you a hero, Dad. Most people would have just let it go or handled it quietly behind closed doors. But you made it public. You made people confront what happened. You're forcing change." Terrence thought about that. Maybe she was right. Maybe sometimes being a hero was just about refusing to let injustice slide by unchallenged. "Your mom told me about the extra credit opportunity in your economics class," he said, changing the subject. "The one about private equity and social impact investing?" "Yeah, I was thinking about using your work as a case study. If that's okay?" "More than okay. I'd be honored. But you have to be objective. Include the criticisms too." "Dad, there's a video of someone pouring wine on your head that has 20 million views. I think I can handle being objective." Terrence laughed and it felt good. It felt normal. Fair point. They talked for a few more minutes about school, about her upcoming exams, about normal father-daughter things that had nothing to do with viral videos or corporate boardrooms. When they hung up, Terrence felt more grounded than he had since the previous night. Over the next several days, the story continued to dominate headlines. The video had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms. Think pieces were being written. Discussions were happening in corporate boardrooms across the country about diversity, inclusion, and unconscious bias. Harrison Pembroke's firing was announced publicly, along with a statement from Meridian Tech condemning his actions. There was speculation about whether Vivian would keep her job. Some articles called for her immediate termination. Others argued she should be given a chance to prove she could change. Terrence stayed out of the public discussion. He declined interview requests from major news networks, from podcasts, from documentary filmmakers. He issued one brief statement through his company expressing hope that the incident would lead to meaningful conversations about equity and representation in business, and then he went silent. But behind the scenes he was busy. He was working with Meridian Tech's board to implement the changes he demanded. He was consulting with diversity and inclusion experts to develop comprehensive training programs. He was reviewing resumes for the new board position focused on equity. 2 weeks after the incident, Vivian Ashcroft requested a private meeting with Terrence. His first instinct was to decline. He'd said what he needed to say in the board meeting. He didn't owe her anything more. But something made him reconsider. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the same impulse that had made him stay silent after being humiliated instead of immediately revealing who he was. He wanted to understand. They met at a neutral location, a quiet restaurant during off hours when it was mostly empty. Vivian arrived before him, which Terrence noted. She stood when he approached the table, and he could see she'd lost weight. The confident, polished executive from the gala had been replaced by someone who looked hollowed out. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said. "I wasn't sure you would." Terrence sat down across from her. "I'm here. What did you want to talk about?" Vivian took a breath. "I wanted to explain. Not to excuse what I did, but to help you understand where it came from." "I already understand where it came from," Terrence said. "Bias. Assumptions. The belief that people who look like me don't belong in certain spaces." "You're right. But it's more complicated than that, and I think you deserve to hear the whole truth." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut. My father was a hedge fund manager. My mother was a former model. I went to Exeter and then Yale. My entire life I've been surrounded by wealth and privilege, and everyone I knew looked like me. I never had to think about race because I never had to think about anything. Everything just came easily." "That must have been nice," Terrence said dryly. Vivian flinched but continued. "When I entered the business world, I brought all those assumptions with me. I saw people like you and I couldn't compute it. Successful black men in finance, in tech, in positions of power. It didn't fit my worldview, so instead of examining my worldview, I found ways to dismiss you. Tell myself you were diversity hires, or you got lucky, or you were the exception, not the rule. And how's that working out for you? It's destroying my career and forcing me to confront the fact that I'm not the person I thought I was." Vivian's voice cracked. "I thought I was open-minded. I thought I was fair. I donated to the right charities, said the right things at cocktail parties. But when faced with an actual situation where my biases were challenged, I defaulted to the worst version of myself." Terrence studied her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked me if I was sorry I did it or sorry I got caught. The truth is, at first I was just sorry I got caught. Sorry my career was imploding. Sorry I was being called a racist on social media. But these past 2 weeks I've been doing a lot of thinking. A lot of reading. A lot of uncomfortable self-examination. And I'm realizing I was sorry about the wrong things." "And what are you sorry about now?" "I'm sorry I made you feel less than. I'm sorry I participated in a system that judges people by their appearance instead of their character. I'm sorry I was so blinded by privilege that I couldn't see my own complicity in perpetuating harm." She looked directly at him. "And I'm sorry it took this massive public humiliation for me to start examining these things." Terrence sat back in his chair. "What do you want from me, Ms. Ashcroft?" "Nothing. I don't want anything from you. I just wanted you to know that what happened that night changed me. Really changed me. Whether I keep my job or not, whether my career recovers or not, I'm not going to be the same person I was before." "Good," Terrence said simply. "Because that person needed to change." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Vivian asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Why didn't you tell us immediately who you were? You could have ended the whole thing right there. Pulled out your phone, shown your ID, made us all look like idiots on the spot." Terrence considered the question. It was something he'd been asking himself too. "Because I wanted to see how far you'd go. I wanted to know who you really were when you thought there were no consequences. And I wanted to feel the full weight of what it's like to be dismissed and humiliated based on nothing but assumptions. It's not the first time it's happened to me, but it had been a while. I needed to remember what that felt like so I'd stay motivated to fight against it. That's a heavy burden to carry. It's the burden every successful person of color carries. We're always aware that no matter what we achieve, some people will only ever see our race." Vivian nodded slowly. "I never thought about it that way. I never had to." "That's privilege," Terrence said. "Not having to think about it. I'm thinking about it now. Every day." Terrence stood up. "I hope you are, Ms. Ashcroft. I genuinely hope this experience changes how you move through the world. But I need you to understand something. My forgiveness doesn't absolve you. This isn't about me giving you permission to feel better about yourself. This is about you doing the work to be better, regardless of whether anyone is watching or keeping score." Vivian stood as well. "I understand. And for what it's worth, I am doing the work. I've hired a coach who specializes in helping leaders address unconscious bias. I've been volunteering with organizations that promote diversity in tech. I'm trying to use this as a catalyst for real change, not just damage control for my career." "Then I wish you well in that journey," Terrence said. He extended his hand and Vivian shook it. As he walked out of the restaurant, Terrence felt something shift. He wasn't sure if Vivian's transformation was genuine or performative, sustainable or temporary. But he appreciated that she'd made the effort to confront him directly, to own her actions, to start the difficult work of change. 3 months later, Meridian Tech released its first diversity and inclusion report. The numbers were stark. Out of 43 executives, only 3 were people of color. Out of 12 board members, only 1 was black. The pay gap between white employees and employees of color in similar positions averaged 18%. Promotion rates told a similar story. But the report also outlined specific, measurable goals for improvement. Hiring targets, mentorship programs, partnership with historically black colleges and universities, a commitment to third-party audits every 6 months to track progress. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to perfect. But it was a start. And it was public, which meant accountability. Terrence attended the press conference where the report was released. He sat in the audience, not on the stage, and watched as Douglas Whitmore presented the findings and the action plan. To his credit, Douglas didn't make excuses. He acknowledged the company's failures, committed to doing better, and introduced the new chief equity officer, a respected expert named Dr. Malik Johnson who had extensive experience transforming corporate cultures. After the press conference, several journalists approached Terrence for comment. He kept it brief. This is a positive step. The real test will be in the execution. I'm encouraged by the commitment I'm seeing from leadership, but words must be backed up by action. I'll be watching closely, as will many others. That evening, Terrence received a call from an unexpected source. It was a young black man named Darius Freeman who'd seen the viral video and had been inspired to apply for an internship at Meridian Tech. He just received an acceptance letter. Mr. Baldwin, I just wanted to thank you, Darius said, his voice full of excitement. I'd been hesitant to apply to companies like Meridian because I didn't think I'd fit in. I didn't think they'd want someone like me. But seeing you stand up for yourself, seeing the changes that followed, it gave me courage to try. Terrence felt emotion well up in his throat. This was why it mattered. Not the policies or the press conferences, but the individual lives that could be changed when systems became more equitable. Congratulations, Darius, Terrence said. You earned that internship. Now go in there and show them what you're capable of. I will, sir. I promise I will. After they hung up, Terrence sat in his study, thinking about the journey from that humiliating night to this moment. The anger he'd felt. The determination to create change. The exhausting work of forcing a corporation to confront its own biases. And now, the beginning of transformation. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Vivian was still at Meridian Tech, now serving as an advisor on the equity initiatives, a role that gave her a chance to contribute to solutions while removing her from direct power. Some people thought she should have been fired outright. Others believed in second chances. Terrence fell somewhere in between. He believed in accountability, but he also believed people could change if they were willing to do the hard work. Harrison Pembroke had disappeared from public life, last heard working for his father's consulting firm in a non-client-facing role. The video of him pouring wine on Terrence would probably follow him for the rest of his life. Terrence didn't feel sorry for him, but he didn't feel vindictive either. Some consequences were simply the natural result of actions. Jennifer Cho had been promoted to Chief Innovation Officer and was leading the development of AI applications for underserved communities. She'd proven herself to be a genuine ally, using her position to advocate for change and to mentor younger employees from diverse backgrounds. And Meridian Tech itself was slowly transforming. Not as fast as Terrence would have liked, but faster than he'd feared. The company had hired 87 new employees in the past 3 months, 42% of whom were people of color. 3 new board members had been appointed, bringing fresh perspectives and expertise in equity and inclusion. Training programs were being rolled out. Promotion criteria were being revised to address bias. The company's stock price had initially dipped after the incident went viral, but it had since recovered and was now higher than ever. Turns out that companies committed to diversity and inclusion tended to perform better, attracting top talent from wider pools and benefiting from diverse perspectives in decision-making. It was good ethics and good business. 6 months after the incident, Terrence was invited to speak at a conference on leadership and equity in corporate America. He'd been declining most speaking requests, but this one was different. It was hosted by an organization dedicated to supporting Black entrepreneurs and executives, and the audience would be people who understood his experience on a deep, personal level. He stood on stage in a hotel ballroom filled with hundreds of faces, most of them brown and black, all of them looking at him with expectation and hope. He thought about what to say. How to capture everything he'd learned. How to inspire without oversimplifying. How to be honest about the challenges while still encouraging people to keep fighting. "Good evening," he began. 6 months ago, I was humiliated at a corporate event. Wine was poured on my head while hundreds of people watched and recorded. I became a viral moment, a hashtag, a symbol. And I want to tell you what I learned from that experience. The room was silent, everyone leaning forward slightly. I learned that racism in corporate America isn't always loud and obvious. Sometimes it's quiet. It's assumptions. It's who gets the benefit of the doubt and who has to prove themselves over and over. It's who belongs and who has to earn the right to be there. Heads nodded throughout the audience. I learned that power without accountability is dangerous. That people in positions of authority can cause immense harm, often without even realizing they're doing it, if they're never forced to examine their own biases. More nods. People were taking notes. But I also learned something else. I learned that change is possible. Not easy. Not quick. Not guaranteed. But possible. When we demand accountability, when we use whatever power we have to push for equity, when we refuse to accept being made to feel less than, we can create ripples that turn into waves. He paused, letting that settle. Some of you in this room have experienced what I experienced that night. Maybe not on camera, maybe not with millions watching, but you know what it feels like to walk into a space you've earned the right to occupy and be treated like you don't belong. You know what it feels like to be twice as qualified and still doubted. You know what it feels like to carry the weight of representation, knowing that your success or failure will be used to judge everyone who looks like you. The energy in the room shifted. People were sitting up straighter. Some had tears in their eyes. And I want you to know something. You are not crazy for feeling frustrated. You are not being too sensitive for calling out injustice. You are not alone in this fight. And most importantly, you are worthy. Worthy of respect. Worthy of opportunity. Worthy of being judged by your merit and not your melanin. Applause started to build, but Terrence held up his hand. Here's my challenge to you. Don't just survive in these spaces. Transform them. Use your positions, whatever they are, to create pathways for others. Mentor someone who reminds you of your younger self. Speak up when you see injustice happening to someone else. Demand accountability from leadership. Build businesses that reflect the values you wish to see in the world. The applause was louder now. And when you face setbacks, because you will face setbacks, remember this. Every door that's slammed in your face is an opportunity to build your own door. Every person who underestimates you is giving you the element of surprise. Every challenge you overcome makes you stronger and more prepared for the next one. He looked out at all those faces, all those dreams, all that potential. They poured wine on my head thinking they were putting me in my place. What they actually did was ignite a fire that led to real, measurable change at a major corporation. They thought they were showing me I didn't belong. What they actually showed was how desperately these systems need people like us, people who've had to fight for everything, people who understand that true leadership means lifting others up, not putting them down. Standing ovation. Thunderous applause. But Terrence wasn't done. So here's what I want you to take from my story. Not that I'm special. Not that I'm a hero. But that each of you has power. The power to demand better. The power to create change. The power to refuse to accept a world that tries to make you feel small. Use that power. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who will come after you. As Terrence left the stage, people crowded around him. Young entrepreneurs wanting advice. Executives sharing their own stories of discrimination and triumph. Parents thanking him for being a role model for their children. He stayed for hours, shaking hands, taking photos, listening to stories, offering encouragement. This was the real reward. Not the money or the corporate reforms or the media attention. This connection. This community. This shared understanding that the fight for equity and justice was ongoing, and they were all in it together. Later that night, back in his hotel room, Terrence video called Patricia and Simone. They wanted to hear about the speech, about the conference, about everything. He told them about Darius and the internship. About the young woman who'd started her own venture capital firm specifically to fund Black-owned businesses. About the father who said his son had been inspired by Terrence's example to pursue a career in finance. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Simone said. "Not just for what you did, but for how you did it. You could have destroyed those people. You had the power to ruin their careers, to make them suffer. But you chose transformation over revenge." Terrence thought about that. Revenge would have felt good in the moment. But it wouldn't have changed anything systemically. "I wanted to create something lasting." "And you did," Patricia said. "You really did." After they hung up, Terrence opened his laptop one more time. He pulled up the video of that night, the one that had been viewed over 70 million times now. He watched himself standing there with wine dripping down his face. He watched the crowd's reactions. He watched himself pull out his phone and calmly send those messages that would change everything. And for the first time since it happened, he watched it without anger, without shame, without the burning need for vindication. He watched it as a historical document, a moment that had catalyzed change, a reminder of how far there was still to go but also how much progress was possible. He thought about young Terrence, the construction worker with $3 in his bank account and dreams that seemed impossible. He thought about all the times he'd been told no, all the doors that had been slammed, all the people who'd underestimated him. And he thought about where he was now. Not just wealthy and successful, but in a position to actually make a difference in people's lives. The journey hadn't been easy. The fight wasn't over. There would be more moments of frustration, more instances of having to prove himself, more battles to fight. But he was ready. He'd been preparing for this his entire life. Terrence closed the laptop and looked out the hotel window at the city lights below. Somewhere out there, in those buildings and streets, were thousands of people like him. People who'd been underestimated and overlooked. People who were fighting to prove they belonged. People who deserved better than a system designed to hold them back. And tomorrow he'd wake up and continue the work. Not because it was easy. Not because he'd solved everything. But because it mattered. Because every policy changed, every bias examined, every door opened for someone who'd been locked out, every young person inspired to keep pushing despite the obstacles, all of it mattered. They'd thought they could humiliate him into silence. Instead, they'd ignited a movement. They'd thought they could put him in his place. Instead, they'd given him a platform to demand change. They'd thought the wine they poured would wash him away. Instead, it had washed away their comfortable delusions and forced a reckoning. In the end, that night at the gala hadn't been about Terrence Baldwin, successful investor. It had been about every person who'd ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And the message that had emerged from that painful moment was simple but powerful. You belong. You matter. You deserve dignity and respect. And together we can build a world that reflects those truths. Terrence smiled to himself and turned off the lights. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new battles to fight. But tonight, he could rest knowing that he'd turned one of the worst moments of his life into a catalyst for meaningful change. And in the end, that was the ultimate triumph. Not revenge. Not destruction. But transformation. For himself, for Meridian Tech, and hopefully, in some small way, for everyone who'd watched that video and decided they too deserved better. If this story touched your heart or made you think differently about the challenges people face, smash that subscribe button and join our community. We share powerful stories of resilience, justice, and triumph every week, and your support helps us continue telling these important narratives. Together, we can amplify voices that deserve to be heard. In the face of bias and injustice, courage and determination don't just win, they transform. They create ripples that become waves. They open doors for those who come after. And they remind us all that true power isn't about putting others down. It's about lifting everyone up, creating systems where talent and character matter more than assumptions and stereotypes, and building a world where everyone truly belongs.